Hello, and thank you for joining me today for the latest in the Global Mapper webcast series. My name is David McKittrick, Senior Applications Specialist here at Blue Marble Geographics. As you can see on the screen, the subject of today's presentation is an introduction to Global Mapper Mobile, a brand new addition to the Blue Marble product suite. This is a mobile application. We're going to introduce the features and functions that are available for those of you who have an iOS device, an iPad, or an iPhone. This is an application you can use in conjunction with the desktop version of Global Mapper to view your data and to do a little bit of data collection as well. So we're going to show you a couple of things. We're first going to show you the components of Global Mapper that are used to facilitate this application. We'll also show you a simulated version. Obviously, it's difficult to show a mobile application in this context, but we've got a broadcast technology that will let us actually show the mobile app screen right on my PC here, so we can share that with you as well. So we'll do a little bit of workflow simulation with the mobile application. Now, this is obviously a recording, so some of our presentations, those of you who have been in attendance with our live presentations will know that we can interact with you through our questions panel. Because this is a recording, obviously that is not an option, but that's not a showstopper as far as questions are concerned. We still provide the opportunity for you to ask us questions directly, and I'll put the link to our support email right in the description. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can see it in the description right down below. So while we can't answer questions in real time, we will answer them when you send them in if you're watching this at a later date. As far as our agenda for today, well, we're going to begin by asking the very basic question: what exactly is Global Mapper Mobile? We'll go at a high level and we'll introduce its primary features and functions. When we get into looking at the simulated version, we'll take a high level look and look at some of the key elements of the interface. It's a fairly intuitive application. It's not very difficult. Some of you may have downloaded this already from the App Store, and if you have, you'll probably find it's fairly easy to interact with the application on your device. One of the key workflow components is generating the necessary data in the desktop version of Global Mapper. This software, this app, does not exist in an isolated form. In other words, it does need to have a licensed copy of Global Mapper in order to function. So we'll go through the process whereby you can generate the maps that ultimately will end up on the device. So we'll go through doing a couple of things. One of those things is going to be creating a template layer. Template layer is essentially a layer that you can set up for the purpose of collecting data in the field. And again, we'll simulate that entire procedure as well as the data collection process on the device. Obviously, once you have that data created, transferring it to Global Mapper Mobile. There are a couple of ways of doing this. You can do it by email. You can use a file sharing service such as Dropbox or one of those cloud-based file sharing services that are available. What I'm going to do is actually use iTunes. I'll physically transfer a file that we create in Global Mapper onto my device using iTunes. Once we have some data in place, once we actually have maps on the device, we'll talk a little bit about the data management process, how to manage your layers. You'll find there's a lot of similarity between what we do in the desktop version of Global Mapper and what we do on the device. Obviously, when we designed this application, we wanted to mirror as closely as possible the experience you would have on the desktop. So you'll find some of the terminology is going to be the same. For instance, we will talk about the digitizer, we'll talk about the overlay control, the ability to manage layers, etc. But it's obviously in a different context. So we want to make sure you're comfortable with the management of the data on the device. Functionally, we will then start to use some of the tools that we have on the device. We'll use the digitizer. There is a full digitizing suite you can use to create points, lines, and polygons or areas right on the device. And we'll also embark on a data collection process. And this is probably the strongest feature of the application, is the ability to collect data. Now, that data collection can be constrained by whatever parameters you establish in the desktop version before you deploy that data. So as part of our workflow, we will collect some data based on a template that we've established prior to transferring that data onto the device. And obviously, on the flip side of that, once you've completed the data collection on the device, we'll talk about how you get that back into the desktop application. So functionally today, we're going to start with Global Mapper Mobile just to give you a high-level overview. We're then going to go into the desktop version of Global Mapper to create some data. We'll then transfer that back into the mobile application, and to finish up, we'll go back into the desktop version again to see that final culmination of our collected data. So that is the plan for today. As you can see, my first question was, what is Global Mapper Mobile? And before we begin a practical hands-on look at the application, it's worth defining it from a high perspective. It is a free mapping app. Right now we are offering the app for iOS devices, as you can see on my bullet. We are planning to have an Android version early next year, early 2017 is the plan. But for right now it's iOS only, so your iPad, your iPhone, I've even heard of some folks putting on an iPod as well. So whatever iOS device you have will support the app, and it is free. Now that's our initial release. We are going to be looking at, in future releases, perhaps building some more advanced functionality and maybe having a different pricing structure, but right now it's a free application. It is important to note that this is a supplement to the desktop version of Global Mapper. It's not an alternative. Folks who see Global Mapper Mobile may think that I can now do everything that I can do on the desktop on my iPad, and that's not the case. We're not replacing Global Mapper or transferring it in its entirety to the mobile device, but rather it's a supplement, or sometimes I've used the word extension, knowing that it's not actually an extension within the app itself, but it's an extension to Global Mapper. It allows you to extend the reach of Global Mapper by putting their maps on the device. Important here, it's not an alternative to the desktop version of Global Mapper. It does offer access to all of your GIS data in the field, and that's really the key component of the application. You know, the data layers you work with in your office, in your working environment, you can now put them on your iOS device and carry them with you into the field. Obviously, utilizing your device's embedded GPS capability, you can see your location, and as we will see when we get into looking at the app itself, we can do a lot of data collection based on that geographic intelligence, that GPS-derived geographic intelligence that we have on the device. It does include an array of digitizing tools as well as form-based data collection functionality, and that form-based data collection is initiated in the desktop version of Global Mapper. You should be using Global Mapper 17.2 or later. That version was set up to support data deployment to the app, and we will see in version 17.2, we will see how we can create essentially a template layer that will allow us to define the parameters for our data collection process. So before we look at the actual data creation, data deployment, transfer process, we're going to begin by just looking at the interface of the app, looking at the key components of the app. We'll look at how you move around on the map, some of the significant windows that are available in there, some of the tools, how you access certain tools in there, some of the settings that can be applied as well. So as I said previously, we will start by looking at the app at a high level. We'll then go back into looking at how do we create data that's deployed to the application. But we'll start by looking at the app itself. So as I said before, I'm looking at a simulated version or a mirrored version of an iPad in this case. This is the app obviously loaded, so we're going to go through the various components of the software, and I'm actually going to be interacting with the device which is sitting right in front of me. You're seeing the mirrored version of that on the screen. Now it's going to be difficult for you to follow exactly what I'm doing when I interact with the touch screen itself, so I'm going to use my mouse, as you can see my mouse on the screen, to indicate where I'm touching on the screen, so hopefully it'll be a little clearer. Obviously you can't see my hand gestures or my interaction directly with the device itself, so hopefully this will become clear when we actually start to go through and go through some of the procedures. When you load up Global Mapper Mobile, first of all, you'll see a map similar to what you see on the screen. This is basically a getting started map. It's something we provide that's embedded in the application. It doesn't really have any functional value. In fact, you can't actually manipulate or save this in any way, but it gives you an opportunity, if you've just downloaded it directly from the App Store, to play with the application, interact with it, and to explore some of the tools that are available. And that's what we're going to do right now. Now, the first thing we should probably take a look at is how you interact with the map itself. And again, to simulate what I'm doing with my finger, let me move my cursor. Right now my cursor is in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean right here, and I'm simply going to move my finger around, and you can see that pans the map. It's fairly intuitive, like most applications with a touchscreen. Simply interacting by clicking and dragging will allow you to move the map around. As again with a lot of image applications, a lot of other mapping applications, the idea of moving fingers apart and together, pinching essentially, allows you to zoom in and zoom out. And I'm just going to do that right now. Again, you can't see that, but we can see the results on the screen. If I want to go into the British Isles, I just essentially pinch my fingers and move them apart, zooming into the British Isles. And we can zoom in, zoom out very quickly and very easily using that mechanism. So again, interacting with the map, fairly intuitive, obviously using the touch screen. A couple of other components I want to introduce right here on the primary window of the application. Right where my cursor is located right now, this is our digitizer. Those of you who are familiar and comfortable using Global Mapper, this is exactly the same function. This enables you to interact with vector data on the map. And what we have on our screen now is actually a vector layer, a sample vector layer, a world map. So if I enable that function, you'll see it turns red. And now I can use my finger and simply tap on a feature on the map. In this case, I tapped on England. You didn't see that, or UK technically. And you can see information about that. Now, we'll come back and look at this dialog box in a little bit. But you can see now we're getting in to the tool that lets us interact with vector data right on the device. This is our attribute table, as well as the other information that's pertinent to the feature that I've selected. I'm just going to hit my cancel button here at the top of the screen to go back to my main map view. And you can see UK is selected. I will deselect it. So that's my digitizer. We will come back and again use that much more detailed way a little bit later. Right next door is the comparable function to my overlay control center. If you're, again, familiar with Global Mapper desktop version, this will provide me a list of all of the layers that I have access to. And again, this is a sample layer, a sample workspace, if you like to call it that. It's not really a workspace in the context of the mobile app, but I've only got one layer loaded. This is my country layer, originated as a shapefile, as you can see. So that's what was deployed. And this button where my cursor is located gives us access to the information about this layer. Now, if we select that layer, you can see we've got the options to zoom to that layer, to move up, move down, etc., etc. Again, I'll come back and look at some of these other options a little bit later. For the time being, I'm just going to simply hit the close option and to go back to the main screen. The third button up here on the toolbar at the top of the screen allows us to display our current location. Now for this, I'm actually going to zoom out just a little bit to give ourselves a little more relevant geographic context, because obviously I'm sitting here in the northeast corner of the US. So when I enable this function, it's going to show me or simulate where I am on the map view. So again, where my cursor is located, that's the section of the touchscreen that I'm now tapping. And you can see where I'm located now. Accuracy is about 10 meters, 5 meters. I'm pretty close to a window here, so I think I am actually picking up a GPS signal. That obviously displays our current location. Lat long is noted there. My elevation is approximated, again, given the known inaccuracy of GPS-derived elevation. It's fairly close. That information will also update if I pan the map. And you'll notice as I start to pan and I move away from my cursor location, I get a crosshair displayed on the screen. That crosshair now indicates the lat long that's being displayed at the bottom, and you'll see that updates as I move around. My GPS location is still noted with a little blue dot over here on the northeast of the US, but my current location is now, or my lat long is now referenced to the current location of my crosshair. So I can quickly see what the lat long is for southern Florida, for instance. If I just want to hover my map location or center my map on that location, lat long is noted at the bottom of the screen. To disable that function, we simply tap the location function and it turns that off. A couple other things to note here. I'm moving towards the bottom of my screen. I'm not actually going to use these functions right now, but we have 3 buttons that enable the data creation functionality. Tools for creating points, for creating lines, and for creating areas or polygons. And we will use those in the context of actually having some realistic map data as a backdrop in just a few minutes. You'll note my scale bar noted here. Scale bar is obviously dynamic. It will update as I zoom, so it reflects the current zoom level of my map. And up here at the top left corner, you'll notice an arrow, little arrow. This brings up my main menu. And this gives me access now to all of the files that I have on my device. Now, as you can see, I've only got one, which is called Getting Started. And that's, you'll note here it's read only. I don't have any option to manipulate this or change it in any way. You'll also note we've given you an option to get more information about the application. I'll just click on that right now, and you'll see it gives you information about the version. It also shows you where you can go to actually get a version of the desktop software. If you haven't actually done that yet and you're using the app as a self-contained and standalone entity, obviously you'll need something to provide map data for the device. All the way at the bottom here, you'll see a link to our website for that purpose. So this is just a kind of a overview of how to get more information. Oh, clicked one time too many. Let's go back to this screen again. Another thing you'll note down here, bottom corner, this is where you go to establish settings for the app. I'll click on that little button in the middle, and you can see there's fairly intuitive list of settings can be established. Background color, whether or not to show the current file name. That's an option that would be displayed in the middle part of the top of the main map view. I'll show you that when we go back to the map display again. And if we want to show our coordinates or not to show our coordinates, that's another checkbox right here on in the configuration area. As far as GPS behavior is concerned, you want to show the accuracy. We noted when I enabled that, it showed me I think initially I was 10 meters, and then it got a little more accurate, got down to 5 meters. That can be displayed or not displayed if necessary. A couple of options here are going to come into context when we actually look at some of the digitizing functions. Record distance interval and record time interval. Now, if you're drawing lines or drawing polygons, you can enable one of those two options that will allow you to place a vertex at a defined distance or on a defined time from the previous vertex. That will come into context a little bit later, but this is where you can establish that setting. If that's the case and you're essentially automatically digitizing as you move, some people like an audible cue that there actually has been another vertex added, and that can be enabled here. Added vertex sound is an option. Notation editor we'll get to a little bit later. This is a new data creation option that we added over and above simply adding attributes to a feature. Let's say you're dropping a point on the map. We have opened up this idea of adding notation as well. It's basically open freeform text you can add, and it will attach that text to the feature itself. That will then be deployed back into Global Mapper, and you can read some notes perhaps or some more extensive information. So a couple of options here determining how that notation editor works. It's like a text editor. You can see auto capitalize, an auto correct, something I need quite a lot actually, an auto correct function. Those are options that can be applied to that notation tool. A couple of miscellaneous options at the bottom. Keeping the application awake. If you don't want it to go into its normal sleep mode, you can enable that. Useful one at the bottom, restoring the defaults. If you change any of these settings and you want to get it back to its default settings, you can simply choose that option and it will return to its default. I did omit one right at the top. Copy attached photos to library. As you will see, one of the options we have when we create a feature is to attach a photograph to that. This is an extremely useful function. The ability to not only record categorized attributes for a particular feature, but actually record that visually as well. And you have the option here, as you can see, to attach any photographs that are created to your library on the device. I'm going to go back to the map view again. So that's a basic introduction to Global Mapper Mobile. As you can see, it's a fairly intuitive application, not a great deal of complexity. Now what we're going to do is introduce the procedure for actually generating maps and deploying them to the device. This next section, as you can see, is called creating a template layer in Global Mapper. It's actually more than that, as well as just simply creating an individual layer. What we're going to do here is we're going to accumulate a lot of different types of data. I'm going to get some examples of imagery, some terrain data, and a couple of different vector layers, and package those up into a file that will be deployed ultimately to the device. We are also going to talk about the templating function, essentially creating a blank template for creating or collecting data in the field. So I'm sure there are some of you who have not used Global Mapper a lot. Those of you who maybe first encountered Global Mapper through the app and maybe haven't used the software a lot. Let me say right now, I'm not going to do a lot of introduction to the capabilities of the desktop version of Global Mapper. If you need some more information, we have an extensive list of online presentations such as this one. If you look in the library or our YouTube channel or on our website, you'll see a long list of webinars, of recorded webinars and webcasts that go over topics like generating contours and working with terrain data, or working with raster data, or using the digitizer, or even, for those of you who are completely new to Global Mapper, we have a few that go over the very basics and introduction to the key components of Global Mapper. So I'm not going to go over the details of how I got to where I got right now. We're just simply going to take the layers that we have displayed in the application right now, and we're going to package these up into a file that will ultimately be deployed to the device, and hopefully we'll see those if everything goes according to plan, we'll see the same data on the simulated version of Global Mapper Mobile. So the process of creating data or creating the necessary files is essentially an export process. From the file menu, you'll see an export option. This is where you essentially can generate external files from any data that's loaded into Global Mapper. And one of the options that's been added fairly recently, I'm working on with version 17.2 of Global Mapper, is to export a Global Mapper mobile file. You need to read these carefully. If you're not familiar with some of the formats, you'll see right above is a Global Mapper package file. Well, that's a file format that's been around for quite a while. That's a file that will allow you to take any and all data that's loaded and compress it into a single file for distribution to another user of Global Mapper, perhaps. That's not going to work in this context. We've created a version of that format that is specifically intended for the mobile application, and that's the second option in this list. Export Global Mapper mobile file is the one that you want to choose. Now, what I want to do in this case is simply take all of the data that's currently displayed on my screen, all the data that's loaded here. And by the way, to give you a little geographic context, this is our corporate building right here. This is Hallowell in Maine, and I've thrown up some parcel data, got some contours. Can't see it, but underneath this image I've also got a terrain layer as well. So kind of a collection of all different types of data. And again, I'm sitting right here in this office just to give you a little bit more of an appropriate geographic context. So from the export menu, as I mentioned, Global Mapper mobile file. This dialog box is exactly the same as the dialog boxes you will see in any of the export functions in Global Mapper. Indeed, many of the analysis functions will give you many of the same options as well. Let me go all the way to the right-hand side to begin with, export bounds. This is, again, where we can define the extent of what it is that we're going to capture. I don't want all my data. I just want a snapshot of what's on my screen, but you have multiple options here in terms of defining the extent of what's going to be captured. A common procedure is for someone to generate a polygon that defines an area of interest and then cropping the exported data to the extent of that polygon. That option would be applied if I selected this checkbox right at the bottom. But what I'm going to do right now is all data visible on the screen. If my data is very large, I can tile it if necessary. If you're dealing with a very large geographic area and you want to create perhaps multiple tiles that are more manageable in size, you can apply tiling. I'm not worried about simplification in this context, but let's go back to the option on the left-hand side, package options. You'll note projection is not available. This is a carryover from our normal Global Mapper package file dialog box, where you can define the projection for that exported file on the assumption that you want to retain that when you deploy it to somebody else using Global Mapper. Global Mapper Mobile is natively geographic lat long, so we don't have that as an option. Oh, it's grayed out. It will never not be grayed out. A couple of other options in here, determining the best zoom level. Use the best possible zoom level will create much larger files. This is going to increase the file size, and more often than not, you will not need to do that. If you want to define the zoom level based on what's on the screen, that is also an option. I find in most cases just leaving that automatic. Let Global Mapper decide the best zoom level to export from. What other options should we look at here? Embedding images associated with picture points. Now, while it's going to be more common for you to embed images that you've actually captured in the field, if you want to send a picture in a file to somebody who's actually going to the job site, this may be useful if you want them to identify a particular asset, a particular feature. You can have that photograph actually embedded into the file that's deployed. Now, needless to say, if you overload your file with a lot of embedded pictures, it can get quite large, but it is an option that you have available. You can combine any vector layers into a single layer. Typically, I wouldn't recommend that. Depends on the number of vector layers, I suppose, but in my case, I have vector layers defining these property boundaries, and I have a vector layer with my contour lines. In this case, I do not want to combine those. I want to be able to manage them independently, so I'm going to leave that unchecked. We do want to maintain our feature styles. We do not want to discard our attributes. Now, again, that's an option if you just want a visual representation of the data. You're not really worried about interacting with the attribution when you're in the field. You can discard those attributes and just have a visual map as opposed to having access to the data itself. So those are the key settings that we could apply. I'm just going to leave them in their default form right now. I'm simply going to click OK, and much as you would with any file management tool or any saving tool, I'm just going to call this one, give it a name and save it, in this case right to my desktop. I'm going to call this one Blue Marble. I'm trying to type and talk at the same time. M-A-R-B-L-E. Just given that's the Blue Marble building in the center of my map. I click Save, and that is now exporting and essentially compressing all of the data within the geographic extent of my current screen view into a single file. Now, before we transfer that packaged file, that series of layers, over to the device and see what that looks like in the context of Global Mapper Mobile, we're going to create another package. But this one's fairly unique because this is essentially going to be an empty layer. Now, while it is obviously possible for you to create data layers and deploy them to maybe your colleagues who work in the field, we feel it's going to be much more common for those folks in the field to actually create data or collect data and send that back to the office. So it is not uncommon then that you will actually start with a blank map and populate that at the job site or in the field wherever you happen to be working. Now, in order to facilitate that process and to make it easy and to ensure consistency in the data that I want my field technicians to collect, I'm going to first of all establish a template layer. And right here in Global Mapper, that process starts right here in the configuration area. I'm just clicking on the configuration button right here in my toolbar and brings up the configuration dialog box. For those of you who are not overly familiar with Global Mapper, this is the area where you establish all of the settings that pertain to how the software works. All the units of measurement, etc., can be assigned in this dialog box. Already selected here, you'll see the feature templates layer. If you're using an older version of Global Mapper, you will not see this option, so you cannot deploy data to Global Mapper Mobile in the process using the process I'm about to show you. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to establish a template for collecting data in the field. Now, to simulate this process, I just made this up when I was planning this presentation. I'm going to pretend that I have some folks in the field who are collecting information on fire hydrants. Just came to the top of my head. So we're going to go through the process of determining what type of data we want them to collect and to establish certain limitations or constraints or requirements that pertain to that data collection procedure. So I'm initially going to create that template. I'm going to click the Add button here, and I'm obviously just going to go down the form here and establish the settings that are pertinent. Template name, well, I'm going to call it hydrants. I'm just typing in the word hydrants, and you can put a description in there as well. I'll repeat what I just did before. This is fire hydrants, so maybe I'll elaborate a little bit. If you want to give a little bit more information, fire hydrants, and you may, fire hydrants in a certain neighborhood, whatever it happens to be. The type of template is important. Obviously, we want to make sure that we're collecting the correct type of data. A template can be based on either points or lines or areas or polygons. Now, if your field deployed technicians are going to be collecting points and lines or points and areas, you would deploy more than one layer based on this template type, different template type assigned to each layer. In our case, this is going to be a point layer. The feature type can also be established. Just for the purpose of what we're doing now, I'm just going to leave this unknown. But you have the same list of feature types that will be available when you're using the digitizer in the application. But we'll leave that as an unknown point feature for this scenario. Feature default name. Now, this is an interesting one. When I was thinking, well, how can I come up with a scenario where this would be useful? Why would you want to give a default name to every asset that's collected in the field? And then it dawned on me, perhaps you want a consistent prefix for all the names. So what I'm going to do right here is type in the word hydrant number, and then I'm going to put a little colon in here, and then I'm going to leave it blank. Now, what that means is every time a point is added to the layer that I'm about to create, this will be the default name. Obviously, the technician, I'll actually put a little space in there as well. So when the technician begins a process of entering additional data, they don't have to type that. That will be obviously pre-populated. Just simply type in maybe an identification number for that particular hydrant. So it's not normal for you to establish a default name, but this is a situation where it may be an applicable function. I'm not going to worry about feature default description in this case, but we're going to go all the way to the bottom here where the real value of this tool resides, and that is the attribute structure. Currently, we don't have any predetermined attributes, but what we're going to do is establish maybe 3 or 4 required attributes that we want our field crew to collect. So to begin this process, we click the Add button, and we'll first of all give the attribute a name. Now, this first attribute that I'm going to assign is going to allow my field technician to establish the condition of the fire hydrant. I'm not a fire hydrant maintenance person, so maybe these are not applicable, but again, please use your imagination a little bit in this scenario. The attribute name, I'm just going to call it condition. And you'll see I can establish a default value. I can also apply allowed values. Now, if I leave this as it is right now, the guy in the field, the girl in the field, the person who's actually collecting this data could basically type what they want. Now, there's obviously no constraint and there's no consistency in my data. I may get all sorts of different information. So what I want to do is I'm going to establish 3 different allowed values. I'm going to first type in the word good. Oops, let me edit that one. Try that again. Good. And new item, again, fair. And you can see where we're going with this. The third will be poor. So they are going to have to choose one of those 3 options. Now, I'm going to assume that most of my fire hydrants are in good condition, so I'm going to establish that as my default value, but they will have the option of choosing one of those the other 2. They cannot put any other additional information in there. That is limited to the 3 options that I placed in this list. We'll click OK. There's my first attribute established. I'm going to add in a second attribute, and again, not being a fire hydrant maintenance technician, and this may or may not be applicable, but I'm going to put in a new value, the flow rate. I assume they can measure the flow rate of a hydrant. In this case, there is no predetermined limitation, so I'm going to leave that one open. I'm going to leave it editable, but I want to make sure that it is added. In other words, you cannot bypass the procedure to go to the next location without inputting a value in here. So value input is required, but there are no defaults. There's no pick list. There's no selection to be made. It's simply open key entry right here. So we'll click OK on that one. I will establish one more. Actually, establish a couple more. Let's go ahead and go add. My attribute name is going to be inspected by, and this is obviously going to reflect the individual who actually visited each hydrant. And we'll go back into our allowed values. We'll add some very short names. We'll do Joe, and we'll add Mary, and the last one is going to be Bill. So again, we would assume that this reflects the list of folks who would likely be my field technicians. Now, for me as a data manager, if I take the time to set this up, and obviously I'm going through these procedures very quickly, but for me to establish these, it ensures that the data that comes back to me, whether this be 3 individuals, whether it be 30 individuals, I know all of the data will be consistent. I can tag it to an individual location because they'll have to select their own name, and I will be able to manage and manipulate that data in a much more streamlined way. So I believe actually that's all I'll do in this case. I think that's probably enough. Sorry, I have to establish. We're going to establish a default here. We'll make Joe's my lead technician, but obviously that can be edited in the field. We'll click OK. Actually, there is one more. I just realized I'm going to add one final attribute, and this attribute is the owner of the fire hydrant. Now, because I work in a particular jurisdiction, all of the attributes for the fire hydrants are going to have the same attribute. I don't want them to change this. So I'm just simply going to type in any, let me try again, any town fire department. Now, the reason I'm actually typing this is because I want this to appear in the attribute table. It will be the same for every fire hydrant. There will not be the option to change this. This template will only be deployed to folks in any town. So I want to make that available, but I do not want to make it editable. I'm going to uncheck that box. The input required is redundant now because it will automatically populate with that value. And as you'll see, when we actually simulate the data collection process, that option will be grayed out, but that attribute will be automatically added every time a point is added to the map. And if there are required attributes that you want to deploy to every point or every feature that's added in the field, you can simply make them uneditable and pre-populate this default value if it's applicable. We'll click OK. So we have 4 attributes that now have been added to this template. The template is called hydrants. We can now apply this template to a layer and ultimately send that layer to the iOS device, to Global Mapper Mobile, as you'll see in a few seconds using iTunes. Now, in order for me to do that, I first need to create a layer. There is no layer in Global Mapper right now. This is the introductory screen. You're all familiar with this. Those of you who have used Global Mapper for a while will be very familiar with this view. But what I can do now is I can create a new layer, a new template layer. I can use that template I established. I can create as many different variations on that layer as I need. Simply right-click in the Overlay Control Center, create a new template layer, and I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call it Anytown Hydrants. Oops, I'm trying to look down and type at the same time. D-R-A-N-T-S, that's better. And I'm going to choose an existing template, and there is a template I just created. That's the template I'm going to use for this workflow. And if I need here, I can edit the template. Everything I think is fine. We'll click OK. And you'll see now I have an empty layer. Now this is a fairly unique situation in Global Mapper because I have a layer on the map, but there's no data. There's absolutely nothing on the map itself. You'll notice my introductory screen has disappeared. So I have a map on the screen as opposed to just those introductory buttons, but there's no actual data. I have a template layer. It's called Anytown Hydrants, and we're now going to deploy that to Global Mapper Mobile for the purpose of collecting data in the field. So the first step in that process is to create a new Global Mapper mobile package file. It's exactly the same procedure that we went through before. From the File menu, Export Global Mapper mobile file. We'll leave the settings just as they are. Export bounds is not relevant in this case because obviously we do not have any preloaded data. So we're just simply going to export an empty package file. We'll click OK with the default settings, and there's my previous GMMP file. This one I'm going to call Anytown Hydrants, and we're now ready to send that to the device. So we've finished the process of preparing data. Initially we created that package file with multiple layers, and we've now created a smaller package file with no data, but a template that will allow us to facilitate the data collection process in the field. What we're going to do next is show the very, very simple process of transferring that data to Global Mapper Mobile. So we completed the process of preparing the data for deployment to Global Mapper Mobile. The first file that we created had multiple map layers. We had some elevation, some imagery, etc., etc. The second of those two was that empty layer, the one with the hydrants. So we're now going to go through the process of actually deploying those or transferring them to the device, to the iPad in my case. As I mentioned earlier, there are several ways of doing this. You can use a file sharing service such as Dropbox. You can transfer the file via email, which may be the most straightforward in many applications. Unfortunately, on the iPad that I'm using, I don't have an email account set up, so that's not an option. So instead, what I'm going to do is use the iTunes method. And you'll see in the screen in front of me here, I have the local instance of iTunes loaded up. Very simple procedure within iTunes. First of all, I'm going to select the icon representing the current iPad. It's called Development iPad. This is one of the devices we use for our internal development process. Over here on the left side, I'm going to click Apps, and if I scroll all the way down to the bottom, it will show me all of the apps that allow me to share files, including, as you'll see, Global Mapper Mobile right here. Currently, there are no Global Mapper Mobile documents on the device. You will recall that there was that Getting Started file. That's a pre-built embedded file, so that's not going to be listed here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add additional files. I'm going to click the Add File button, and I'm going to go scroll to my desktop. There's my Anytown Hydrants. There's my Blue Marble, the one we created initially. I'm going to click Open, and you'll notice both of those are now added to this list. That is essentially real-time transfer. I've got a cable here connecting my laptop to the device itself, so they've been deployed in real time. I'm just going to click Done, close the window, and we will then go back into the Global Mapper mobile app, and we will see those layers on the device itself. So in this next section, we're going to introduce the data management components. Now, we introduced the interface of Global Mapper Mobile very quickly in a kind of hypothetical context because we didn't have any data loaded. Now that we have deployed data, we can take a look at the layer management tools, how to turn layers off, how to turn layers on, how to reorder the layers. And basically how to manage data on the device. We have two files on there. We can activate one file at a time. We'll activate the initial blue marble file I created with those multiple layers. A little bit later, we'll also activate the hydrants layer for the purpose of data collection, but one of those can be activated at a time. So we'll take a look at the layer management capability of Global Mapper Mobile. So here we are back in the simulated version. Once again, you may notice I've switch this around. We're looking at a kind of a landscape perspective now as opposed to the portrait view. Kind of it works better with most mapping applications to have this kind of a horizontal perspective. And when we start it up, we've still got the getting started map on screen, that initial view. I'm going to go to the main menu and move my cursor over here to show you where I'm tapping on the iPad right in front of me. I'm going to tap right here on the arrow. It's going to take us to our main menu, and you'll notice now we have the two additional layers, the blue marble layer, which contains all of the different types of data, and then we've got the Anytown hydrants layer, which is the layer that doesn't have any data. The visual representation of that is just a generic map. There's no data, so it can't actually represent that on the screen. You'll notice the blue marble map is actually a thumbnail of the map itself. Now, first thing we're going to do is we're going to tap on the blue marble, and we're going to actually display that on our main map view. It's going to replace the getting started, and just to allow us to look at some of the data management tools now that we actually have some layers loaded. Well, first thing, just by way of recapping what I just said, in terms of deploying data to the map view, you simply select the file, and obviously you can have as many files as you want on the device. You can load up what would be comparable to a workspace in the desktop version of Global Mapper. You can load it up and display that combination of layers if it's applicable. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. The map will eventually refresh and crisp up those contours a little bit. So we can interact with a set of layers that are contained within an individual file. Those files, by the way, have a GMMP suffix. You may have noticed that when I sent them over. Global Mapper Mobile Package files, GMMP. Make sure you note that final M, or that second M, because it is distinct from the normal GMP, Global Mapper Package files, which are intended for desktop use only. I know we mentioned this earlier, but it is worth reiterating that this is not the same file. So as far as layer management is concerned, again, loading up this individual file gives me access to, in this case, it's actually 4 different layers, one of which is currently not visible because it's underneath the imagery, but we'll show how we can now manage the display of data on the device using a function which is comparable to the overlay control center in the desktop version of Global Mapper. We quickly introduced this earlier, but now that we actually have some data deployed, it makes a little more sense. I'm going to, again, tap on the screen right here where this layer tool is, the overlay control tool, and it gives me a little window that shows me within this file, within the file called Blue Marble, the one I created a few minutes ago, we now have 4 different layers. My elevation, which is the layer I cannot see. I'm not sure why it says contours here, to be honest. That's a little unusual. I may have given it a descriptor. There's my imagery layer, there's my parcels, and there's my contours. Those are the actual vector contours themselves. An indication on the left side what type of data, vector, imagery, or raster, and elevation. Well, just to show you some of the basic functionality, I'm going to take a look first of all at the contours. I'm simply going to tap on my screen, and it'll give me the options you see here. I'm not going to go through each of those, obviously, fairly intuitive. I can move them up, move them down, I can hide, remove, I can access metadata, gives me a summary of all of the information pertaining to that layer. What I'm going to do just in this case is just hide that layer. It's not going to remove it, it's not going to take it away permanently, it's just simply going to remove it from display on the map. Obviously, if I want to, you can see it's gray right now. I can reactivate again if I need to. Another thing I'm going to do here is select the elevation layer. Again, highlight that. In this case, I'm going to move it down. Right now, it's in the similar layering structure that we find in the desktop. It's sitting at the top of the pile in terms of the list, which means it's at the bottom of the map. So I'm going to move it down in the list, and hopefully, when I do, it will then be displayed. And again, you can see now I have the elevation layer, that gridded layer, now sitting below the imagery, which means it's more prominent. It's actually higher on the list on the map, and I've got my parcels. So that's just a couple of examples of how you can use the layering structure and how you can manage data. We'll close that once again. We'll go back using the little arrow at the top, and we can have as many of these files as our device has a capacity to hold. So people often ask us, how much map data can I get on the device? It really comes down to how much storage space is available on your iPad or your iPhone. But as you can see right now, I've got a couple of different files. So we briefly talked about the digitizer when we introduced the interface of the app. Now we're going to go back and visit it again. We're actually going to use some of those digitizing tools and show you how you can create points, lines, or areas, and how you can modify or edit those as necessary. You can attach an image, you can add annotation, you can add essentially free-form text, or you can use the constraints that are embedded within the template layer that we created and deploy that package or that file to somebody in the field for the purpose of collecting predefined data based on the parameters you've established in the desktop. So right where we left off earlier, where we were talking about our layer management, we're back into the same view, viewing all the files. But in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to select the template layer. We're going to essentially remove the previous set of layers, and we're going to activate any town hydrants, which will show us essentially a blank map. And this is the easel or the canvas on which we're going to use some of the digitizing tools. We're going to show some of the digitizing capability. Now, the digitizer tool, as I'd explained earlier, similar to what you find in the desktop version of Global Mapper, allows you to, first of all, interact with existing vector files. And we're going to do that. Actually, we actually have created some data. So this tool right now, as you can see, is activated. I'm going to deactivate that. We don't need to actually select anything on the map. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to move towards the bottom of the screen. And we're going to address the 3 different options for actually using these drawing functions in Global Mapper. And for each of these, there are a number of different ways that we can actually create data. Some are manual, some are automatic, as you will see. So the first thing I'm going to do is select the area tool right here, bottom right corner, and you'll notice when I select it, when I tap it on the screen, I have 4 different options for creating or for digitizing, or for, in this case, for creating an area. The one that I'm actually going to do right now is manual tap, because as you'll note, the other 3 involve the assumption that I'm actually actively picking up a GPS signal, and I would assume therefore moving around and basically being able to digitize as I move, which is a very, very useful component of this app. Obviously, I'm not going to be moving around in this case. Unfortunately, today it's a beautiful sunny day outside, but I'm stuck in my office. So I'm going to use the manual process to simulate what you could do in the field. The GPS tap, this second option you see on this list, is a very useful one, because as you're moving around with this activated, you simply have to tap anywhere on the screen for the app to add a vertex at that location. Now, remembering we're creating a polygon or an area right now, so if I'm walking the boundary of a property, for instance, I don't have to manually place that vertex. I simply walk to the location of the corner or one of the areas that I want to record, and I simply tap anywhere on the screen. It will automatically add a vertex at that location. The other 2 options, we referred to these in passing when we introduced some of the settings within the app: GPS auto distance or GPS auto time. Once again, if you recall, I have the option in the settings to establish what that distance and what that time would be. These tools allow me to create a polygon which is defined as I move with a predetermined distance threshold. Let's assume that I establish a 10-meter threshold. As I begin the process, when it recognizes that I've traveled for 10 meters, it will add a new vertex. Travel another 10 meters, again, it will add a new vertex. It does that automatically based on that distance threshold or based on that time threshold. What we're going to do is very quickly draw a polygon using this manual tap procedure. Now, with apologies, you can't see what I'm doing here. I'm simply tapping on my screen. There's my first point. You'll notice a little yellow dot. Second point, third point. And you'll notice as I do that, that third point, you'll see automatically it's apply to fill. This is the same visualization you'll find in the desktop as well. I'm just going to leave it as it is right now, and we're done. Now, a couple of ways we can finish this. Easiest way is simply to use this little checkbox. I'll move my cursor all the way to the bottom corner here. This little checkbox is a confirmation that you're done. There's an undo function as well. If you want to remove the last vertex, you have that undo. But what I'm going to do is simply tap on that little checkbox, and it's immediately prompted me with the option to determine where this feature is going to be added in terms of the layers, its name, its description if that's applicable, and any attributes I want to add. Now, this is a raw digitizing process. There is no predetermined attribute structure here. If, while you see this, you think, well, it would be nice if I could have pre-populated this attribute table with some existing fields. Well, if you wanted to do that, again, go back to the templating option I showed you before. We'll use that one for our points in just a few minutes. But if you wanted to involve a preset collection of attributes, then using a template is a way to do it. I'm not actually going to add any attributes in this case. I'm just going to very quickly finish the process of creating by clicking the OK button. It will apply the default settings, putting in a default layer called user created features. Those of you familiar with Global Mapper will be familiar with that layer. Simply going to click OK, and it will save my polygon. It even zoomed me to that extent. So there's my first digitized feature created. If I go to the overlay control center now, or the control center, again, showing you where my cursor is located, right up here, it will show me now that I have a layer, user created features. I have the hydrants layer as well. I'm waiting a little bit to use that one. In a few minutes we'll see how that one works, but I now have a new layer with the one new feature I've created. I'm going to click the close button, close that window. Let's look at the line tool. Right next door. By the way, I didn't point out, but you'll notice that with the area tool active, it highlights it in red. Moving next door, the line tool works exactly the same way. In fact, if I tap on it, you will see exactly the same options. Manual, GPS tap, auto distance, and auto time. Once again, in my case, manual tap, because I'm sitting in my office, and this time we'll draw a line. Same procedure as before. Unfortunately, you can't see what I'm doing, but I'm just tapping on my screen. First point appeared, as you see. We'll continue to add a few additional points. Each vertex added, as you'll see. And I'm done. Once again, confirming that in the lower left corner of my screen. And once again, we get the same dialog box. A couple of things I will point out. We'll change the procedure a little bit with each additional feature we create. If I look at the vertices, this vertices list, this will give me the option to display all of the vertices for that feature. And if I want to remove one specifically, I can select it, and at the bottom of my screen I have the option to delete that vertex if it's necessary, or I can add an additional vertex manually as well relative to the one that I've just created. I'm not sure in a practical sense when you would do that. If you know the lat long for a particular corner of a property, for instance, or a particular point along a line, certainly by all means you can add a vertex at that location, but it's not very likely that you'll do that that often. Final option here, if I go ahead and tap in the middle, is just to edit what's been highlighted. So I'll just go ahead and show you that very quickly. Just that one vertex now, the lat long of that vertex, as you can see noted here. By the way, one of the things you'll notice about my lat long values, they are very close to 0, which would put me somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, I believe. The reason for that is I don't have GPS active here, so when I deployed that layer, it gave me a default centroid of 0, 0. So obviously in the real world, this would not be the case. Your GPS signal, and using that GPS data collection process, you would not have had the issue that I'm having here. Obviously, I'm dealing with a hypothetical situation in this case. So we'll cancel that. One other thing I will point out here, while we have the new feature dialog box open up, down at the bottom, the options to create an annotation layer or to create or to attach a photograph. Again, my cursor's bottom right corner here. I'll just show you very quickly. If I needed to type over and above whatever attributes that I have added for this particular feature, this annotation option is basically free-form type. And if I simply tap on my screen, it brings up a normal keyboard. This is a river. If I can type properly. So as you can see, it's just open form type. It's just like adding something in Notepad. We click OK, and that annotation, that additional annotation, is now added to the features or the characteristics of this feature within this layer. Ultimately, obviously, everything I collect here will be deployed back into Global Mapper for management in the desktop application. But over and above any attributes you add manually, this annotation is another option. The plus sign, as you can see where my cursor is located, lets me add new attributes, giving it a name, giving it a value. This is the common procedure for adding attribution that you'll see again in the desktop version of the application. We'll just go ahead and cancel in that case. So we'll click OK, just to complete the process of digitizing my line, as you can see. So creating lines, creating areas, basically the same procedure. Now the final button, I'm moving from right to left here, final button is probably the most valuable, most important one of all, and it's probably the one that's going to be used most commonly. The idea of just simply tagging a specific location, ultimately adding a point to the map. So we're going to tap on that one, and it's exactly the same as my lines and my areas. I've got the option to determine the location based on GPS. Now I have to say, in real world applications, that's what you're going to use 95% of the time. The idea of doing what I'm doing, which is essentially manually identifying a point on the map, is not that useful. In fact, if I was simply manually identifying it based perhaps on some loaded imagery, I could just as easily do that sitting in the comfort of my office rather than being in the field. So it's going to be much, much more common for you to employ your embedded GPS capability to collect data based on a GPS derived location, or to create points based on those distance and or distance or time thresholds. But to simulate that, once again, I'll go with the manual tap option, and I'll put a point right here on my map, just tapping on the screen. And once again, we have the option to populate this with whatever attributes are applicable. Now, in this case, instead of applying this to the user created features layer, which we went to the defaults previously, I'm going to deploy this to my Anytown hydrants. Now, if I had begun this process without actually creating a line and a polygon, that would be the only layer that would be available here. So I'm simply going to tap Anytown hydrants, and you'll notice that checkbox over here on the right side is now active, indicating that it's going to be added to that layer. Now, this is where the real value of this data collection process comes into its own, because simply clicking OK now will now prompt me to fill out these required attributes that I established in the desktop a few minutes ago. First of all, the condition of the fire hydrant that I've just tagged. Well, this one is in a fair condition. It's average. We'll click OK on that. Next one. The flow hydrant, I guess I typed that wrong. The flow rate of the hydrant. This is an open text input here. I can simply type whatever value, 2, 3, 4. I'm not exactly sure what those values would be. I'm not a fire hydrant technician, but again, this is an open text input. If you remember, we didn't actually constrain this with any requirements. I'll click OK to apply that one. Who am I? Well, I'm Bill here, so we'll go ahead and select the name Bill at the top. And again, click OK. Now, those were the only requirements that I had with that layer. If you'll note, I have the owner, if you can recall, was my default. I did not make that editable. That's going to be added automatically. That attribute will be assigned to every point that I add to this layer. So obviously, you can go further with this. You can add additional attribution. You can apply different constraints. Make sure they're typed correctly. Flow hydrant. I'm not sure why I typed flow hydrant, but you get the idea how it works. That's the most important thing. When you're done, simply click OK. And that point is now added to that layer. We'll just add one more hydrant just for the purpose of illustration here. Again, just simply typing approximately at my cursor location. Again, we're prompted with the same dialog box. Make sure it goes to the right layer. Click OK. And this time, this is a poor condition. Click OK once again. I'm moving my cursor, but obviously I'm not clicking on the screen. We'll type in a value of 678. And again, click OK. And this time I'm Bill again. Click OK. So same procedure as before. With any of these layers, we could, if we wanted to, add additional attributes. Now, there's really no necessity to do that. If I deploy this file to the technicians in the field, there's really no need for them to have to do any of that work themselves. The onus is on the data manager back in the office to set up whatever constraints are required. One thing he can do right here is attach a photograph. And I'm just going to show you the dialog box without going any further. If I were in the field and I were standing at that fire hydrant and I want to show it's damaged in some way, simply open up the camera, that first option, and take a photograph. It will automatically attach that photograph to this particular point, which ultimately will be deployed back to the desktop again. Obviously, in the simulated version of what I'm doing right now, I can't do that, but that option is available to you. And we'll click OK one more time to finish this second process. So that's a basic procedure for using the digitizer. Obviously, in a real-world situation, you would collect much more data. Perhaps you would spend a week out in the field, and at the end of the day on Friday, perhaps you would then send that data back. And what I'm going to show you next is the procedure then for taking this collected data and sending it back into the desktop version of Global Mapper. So we've reached the final bullet, workflow. Started with Global Mapper, created the data, did a little data collection simulation. Now we're going to go back into the desktop. So we're going to talk about the process of transferring data from Global Mapper Mobile, ultimately loading it into the desktop version of Global Mapper. So when we left off previously, we had created a couple of digitized features, well, 4, I guess 2 points, polygon on the line. Now, the real purpose of this simulated data collection was based on this fire hydrant scenario. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the line, I'm going to remove the polygon. We don't need those. The way I'm going to do that is simply go to the Overlay Control Center, the option here in the top of the screen, and the user created features layer is what I assigned the line and the polygon to. I'm going to select that, just tap on it. I'm going to move down. I'm going to remove it right here where my cursor is located. You can see I've got the option to remove. This is not just hiding it, this is actually removing it. So anything that I've done in that layer will not be retained, warning me that that's going to be gone. I'm fine with that. I click yes, and I'm left with just the one layer that I'm most interested in, which is the layer which has my 2 points. So I'm going to take these 2 points, my fire hydrants, I'm going to send them data, remembering that what came up into Global Mapper Mobile to start with was an empty layer. It now has some points. I'm going to send this back to Global Mapper, to the desktop version of Global Mapper. That procedure is initiated going back to the main menu of the application, right up here in the top left corner. Click that little arrow, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the Anytown Hydrants layer, and I'm going to save. Now, as you can see, I've got the option down here at the bottom. When I select that option, it's given me the option either to save or to save as. What I want to do in this case is save as, because if I simply save the layers that I have loaded, it will retain the 2 points. What I intend to do in this scenario is to keep the original file, which was empty, that I can then load up again, perhaps another day, perhaps in another area, and start afresh, start from scratch. What I want to do is save as, so I'm going to use the second of those 2 options. By the way, you'll notice I can directly email as well. If it recognizes a local email account, it will automatically attach the file to an email. I want to save as, and I'm going to give this a name other than what you see here. Obviously, I want to change that. So I'm going to make it Anytown Hydrants 1, just to make it distinct. And we'll click OK. So that file is now saved. If I go back to the original, you'll see I now have Anytown Hydrants and Anytown Hydrants 1. Back in the iTunes, I will now have the opportunity, as you'll see in just a minute, to take that file, that Anytown Hydrants 1, move it back over to the desktop, move it back over to my PC, and load it up into Global Mapper. So once again, simplest way for me to manage the give and take of data with the app is using the iTunes, and I'm going to go through the same procedure I did before. I'm going to select a little icon here indicating I'm going to my device, go to Apps, over here on the left side, scroll down, and when I get to the bottom, select Global Mapper Mobile. Now you can see the 2 files that I sent originally, but also now you can see the version that I just saved. And to simplify this, what I'm going to do is simply drag this right over here to my desktop. And basically that's the copying process. When we then load up Global Mapper, I'm going to File, Open. I'm going to go find that file, hopefully right on my desktop, and load up Anytown Hydrants 1, and that's fine. And you'll see now I've got my 2 hydrants. Oh, I forgot to fill in the number when I was on the device. I apologize for that. So where I established a default name, I had intended to actually give it a more specific name simulating a number. Well, obviously I didn't do that, but you can see how that could have been done as well. So just to verify, if I select one of these, this is the first one I created. That second, actually, this is fair. There's the flow and inspected by, and we can do the same for the other one as well. So we have all of our data now back in Global Mapper, from where it can be printed, it can be exported in any of the supported vector formats, it can be saved as a local workspace in Global Mapper. We could take data from multiple field technicians, if you like, and have it deployed into a single instance of Global Mapper for the purpose of data management. So a little bit convoluted there, but hopefully you get an idea as to how that workflow evolved from creating data, deploying data, collecting data, and then transferring that data back to the desktop version again. So So that was a quick overview of Global Mapper Mobile, the primary functionality and the data management tools and data collection tools that are available in there. I will put a couple of links in the description down below, one for any emails you may have, for any questions you may have. I'll also put a link to the page on our website if you want to actually go find out a little bit more, some of the documentation about the app, and I'll put a link to where you can download it if you have an iOS device. As I said at the start, it is free. You can get that at no cost. It does require you to have a version of Global Mapper, obviously, to go through the workflow that I showed you in terms of actually deploying map data to and from the device. You'll need that desktop application. So thank you for spending time today, and we'll speak to you next time at the next Global Mapper webcast.